And so I, young and stupid, said, absolutely. Having no idea what she would do, she reached down, she pulled off her top, and began nursing topless. It was a situation we'd never covered in my work at the preacher class back at Harding College. We'd talked about preparing sermons, we'd practiced baptizing each other in the old pool, all of that, but we'd never covered how to hold an evangelistic study if somebody's topless. And so I held what is probably the record for the quickest evangelistic Bible study ever. When we were done, I looked over. Buford is now in a full coma. So I pick him up. I walk him out. He's walking like Herman Munster as we go out to the car. He's driving. I set him down, and I can tell he's mad. He's not going to say a word. He's mad. Finally, right before we got to his house, he turned to me and said, "You just had to tell her to nurse, didn't you?" And drove. But you could never say anything very bad about Buford to me because he became like a dad. And then I've been able to live long enough that I've been on the other end of that. When we first moved to Abilene, Diane was soon pregnant with our third child, and Megan was, God love her, it was like she knew she wasn't going to live long, so she wasn't going to waste time sleeping, and we were always worn out. So that summer, I decided to ask the teenager who lived behind us if she would like to watch Megan. So Elizabeth started coming over, and after her first day, she went home and told her mom, "That's the hardest thing I've ever done. I don't ever want to do it again." And her mom, to her credit, made her go back. And the same thing happened to Elizabeth that happened to everybody that got close to my daughter. She fell in love with her. And Megan became like her sister, and then she became like my other daughter. I knew I had arrived at that position when one night at 12:30 in the morning, which is the middle of the night for me, 12:30 in the morning, the phone rings, and I pick it up, and it's Elizabeth, and she's sobbing. She said, "The jerk broke up with me, and I don't want to get back in the car with him. Would you come pick me up?" There was a question I wanted to ask, but I held off for a moment. I said, "Of course, dear, I'll be right there. Tell me where, I'll come." She told me, and I said, then I had to ask her, I said, "Is your dad not home?" And she said, "Yes, he's home." I said, "Why didn't you call him?" She said, "I can't. It's 12:30 in the morning. I'd wake him up." Paul is trying to create that. You are like a grandma. You are like a grandpa. You've got people in your church. You've got people in these other tribes in which Christ has worked. Unity trumps disunity. Love trumps bitterness. Inclusion trumps holding people at arm's length. It always does, because Christ is at work within us. And then, not only the language of unity, and this one I promise will be quicker, it's the language of affirmation. Not just what happened. You were baptized into the same family and you have the same story, but what's he doing? And can you hear Paul? He from the other side of the Adriatic, from Corinth, he's pointing to those little house churches in Rome saying, Epinetus, oh man. It's one thing to say, yeah, me too, I'll cross the line of conversion, but it's another thing to be the first convert in Asia. So don't you mess with Epinetus. And Mary's worked hard for you. And Aquila and Priscilla, maybe somebody was having a hard time with them, and Paul says, please, don't give them a hard time because they risked their lives for me. And there's Apelles. He says Apelles has been tested and tried. And then those sisters, Tryphena and Tryphosa, whose parents must have run out of names. He says they work hard in the Lord. And he keeps calling people my fellow workers, my beloved brothers. Now here's the thing, had we been there, I think we would have thought, who's he talking about? Because from our distance, we can imagine these were all super saints. But you know, they weren't. They were just like the people gathered here and who are in your church and in our churches. Paul had the brilliance of looking at them and instead of picking on the stuff that was irritating, saying, oh, this is somebody, do you know about her? Do you know she's taught the kindergartners for 30 years? We ought to name the church after her. Do you know that this guy goes down every Friday morning at 5:30 in the morning, and he feeds the people who come who have no other meal? Do you know all of these stories? And I can picture him going down, and then between our churches saying, hey, don't give the disciples a hard time. Do you realize what they've done? Do you know how they've kept this restoration vision alive? Do you know they were missional before missional was invoked? Do you realize the disciples have loved and fed and clothed? And the independent Christian churches, do you know the word of evangelism that comes from them? Do you know the passion with which they study how to bring the word of Christ to a culture? And churches of Christ, well, I'd let you fill that blank in because that's my own tribe. But you could. And we've got ways of looking at each other. We could stereotype and we could say, oh, they're just like this, but they're not like that. If we have Paul's brilliance, we not only will have the theology of saying accept one another, but we will underneath the document say, and here are the stories of what Christ has done. And I'm telling you, it'll matter if we can get that.